Okay, welcome those who are joining us. We're so glad to have you here today for our webinar and report release about AI and the future of learning, our expert panel report. We're going to wait a few minutes for attendees to sign on. So just to let you know, you are definitely in the right place and we're glad to have you here. It's just going to be a few minute delay to give everyone a chance to attend. My name, by the way, is Jeremy Rochelle. I'm at Digital Promise, and I lead the Circle Center, the Center for Integrative Research in Computing and Learning Sciences. And while we're waiting to start, I just put a couple of resources that may be of interest to people joining on to this call. One is an open NSF call for proposals. It's called REDL. Research in, I think, exploratory teaching and learning. It's due January 25th. And if you search for those, that string to the right, you'll quickly find that call for proposals. We're also inviting you to look at our website, circles.org. We'll have many more events like this. Consider signing up for our newsletter. And this report will be up at any moment. I think the release should be happening as we speak, so you can do that. And I just want to let you know that the webinar and circles involve many institutions. I'm at Digital Promise, but these are some of our partners. This is work funded by the National Science Foundation, and this expert panel in particular also benefited greatly from the US Department of Education participating. So we are just welcoming people to the room. We haven't really started yet. If you're just coming in, you haven't missed anything. We're just waiting a minute or two more for participants to sign in. My name is Jeremy Rochelle. I'm at Digital Promise and I'm representing the Circle Center. And we're really glad you're here. We're just going to wait basically another minute and then we're going to get started. It's really nice to see that we have over 160 people have joined for this webinar. And we will have opportunities for questions and answers. So as you go, if you have a question, feel free, jot it down, and there'll be a time a little later on in the hour when we'll be able to take that question. I'm just going to wait one more minute for people to join, and I'll just one more time flash this screen showing some resources that you may be interested in. The NSF opportunity to write a proposal to REDL, the release of this report, and also you can sign up for our newsletter. Of course, we'd also love to have you follow us on Twitter. I think now's a great time to get started. So let me just begin by introducing our panelists today. They all participated in the expert meeting that we had a couple months ago that led to this report, and I'm going to give them a chance to introduce themselves. So let me turn first to Sidney. Would you introduce yourself? I'm going to turn this presentation off. Go ahead, Sidney.
Hi, good to see everybody. I'm Sidney D'Mello. I'm an associate professor at the Institute of Cognitive Science. I study artificial intelligence in education, collaboration, and a host of topics around those. I'm also, it's my pleasure and privilege to lead the NSF National Institutes on Student AI Teaming. So I'd love to share my experiences with you on that exciting adventure. Thank you.
Marcelo, you're next on my screen.
Hello, everyone. My name is Marcelo Worsley. I'm an assistant professor of learning sciences and computer science at Northwestern, where I do a lot of different work related to AI and thinking about designing learning environments and also in terms of using AI and using learning analytics to assess learning.
Great to have you with us today, Marcelo. And it's also great to have a long-term colleague, Janice Gobert, with us. Would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm a full professor in learning sciences at Rutgers School of Education. I'm also the CEO of a company called Apprendis that is productizing work that's been done in my group for several years on performance assessment for science. So we use educational data mining and natural language processing algorithms to auto score, auto scaffold, and auto alert for the NGSS science practices.
That's great, thank you. And my co-editor in producing the event, the expert panel, and also co-hosting the panel. Thank you very much for doing that, James, and for co-editing the report, James Lester.
Hi, everyone. I'm James Lester. I'm a faculty member in computer science at NC State, where I direct the Center for Educational Informatics. We do lots of work on all kinds of subject matters, many kinds of learning technologies for K-12 and beyond, and very excited to be here today.
So it's great to have this panel with us. Let me switch my windows. Here we go. Thank you for introducing yourselves. I'm just going to take a minute to give everyone a quick overview of the meeting we held that led to this report, and then we're going to get into it with a couple questions to the whole panel. Believe it or not, we had a 7-hour Zoom meeting over 2 days, and 22 experts not only attended, but were super active and engaged during that time. And if you go to the report, you can see everyone who was involved. We were grateful for that engagement, and it's because I think we presented tough questions and had good activities that broke people out in small groups and other formats to keep the energy flowing. We did have opening remarks that really directed us to how important AI in the future of learning is. And it's not just what we already see, but people like Karen Marangella at the National Science Foundation and Jake Steele at the US Department of Education are really taking the long view that in the next 5 to 10 years, this is going to become even more important. And we need to start figuring out now what the issues are that we will face 5 to 10 years from now, so we can get the research ahead of the eventual dissemination and spread of this technology. Our meeting resulted in extensive notes, and that's how we generated the report, is based on the expert panel and all the notes and transcripts. Here's an example of an exercise we did in the meeting to give you a flavor of the expert panel. We used a software for this called Mural. It's like Jamboard as well. And we asked the experts to consider 4 things. What are strengths of AI that are going to be important in the future? What are some weaknesses that have to be overcome? That's just in the AI. But then on the right-hand side, what opportunities is that creating in education? And what kind of barriers do we need to pay attention to? And so everyone was able to post notes and discuss. And this use of a format like this really, I think, led to some really insightful and deep conversations among the 22 people. One of our goals was not just to have one person talking, but to have everyone active during the 2-day event. One thing that came out of that, and I think James may talk to this a little bit in a little while, is people were discussing some design concepts, or maybe Sidney was going to talk to this, some design concepts that were going beyond what we've heard about from the past decade. We've heard so much about personalizing and adapting, but what about the fact that multiple people are in a room together learning, teachers, learners, mentors, aides, and they're using multiple computers and multiple resources. How can we orchestrate those? We heard a lot about really thinking first from augmenting the role of the teacher, not just on the side, or not just linking by a thin link like a dashboard. People saw ways in which the opportunities to interact with technology are becoming much more natural, with speech and gesture becoming more available modalities, that we could broaden the competencies that we can assess. So, you know, we traditionally assess a very narrow range of what we actually care about in society. And could AI help us with that? And then connecting across learning contexts was a big theme. After they articulated some of these ideas, we grouped the experts in small teams to discuss in some more detail 2 very broad scenarios. One was about classroom orchestration. We'll get into that in a bit. And the other is about how innovation could be, assessment could be innovative. And we tried in this graphic for the cover photo of our report to indicate some of those themes of connected learning across contexts and across technologies. We'll come back to this, so I'm really not going to go after this, but our expert panel came up with 7 broad recommendations for if we're taking that 5 to 10 year view out into the future, what are the things we have to start paying attention to now? So AI for learning, AI that supports teachers was really big, AI for assessment, human-centered or responsible AI, really getting our policies together for ethics and equity, informing all the stakeholders, and then the idea that this is going to be the accomplishment of an ecosystem. So I hope we'll get some chances with our panelists to discuss all those things. I'm going to stop sharing now and invite our panelists to join with me and discuss the first question that we prepared. And so that is, you were all in the panel, you were super engaged. What did you find really important about what the group of 22 experts was discussing? And what opened your eyes to something, a new possibility, or made you think about a risk that you maybe didn't pay as much attention to before? Who'd like to go first?
I can go first.
Okay, James.
So I was so struck by the incredible breadth of discussions at the panel. It was just really remarkable. So I have thought about what's the difference between kind of today and the dawn of AI ed. So 1970, Jaime Carbonell wrote sort of the seminal paper on AI. And as fantastic as it was really a person sitting at a terminal typing back and forth. And I think about the difference between that vision and the sort of collective vision that we saw in our discussions, and just the kinds of learning interactions and the depth of engagement of students who would be helped. So teachers would be helped just as much as students would be helped. The breadth of subject matters that would be supported, the kinds of competencies, like we're going to be, I think today, talking a little bit about collaboration, for example, as a first-class competency, not as kind of an extra or an add-on. The whole idea of having multiple modalities to feed data that can inform the decision-making. So imagine having learning technologies that can, in some sense, really understand the learner and collections of learners. I mean, it's just a really remarkable vision. So for me, it was sort of this like really kind of night and day difference between the solo learner sitting in this cold room at a machine and these really rich learning interactions that take place both formal and informal, but also profoundly change what it means to be a learner.
That really resonates with me, James, because as you may know, I got my start looking at 2 kids collaborating to learn physics in front of a computer. And gesture and informal speech was such a big deal to how they were really learning. But in the room next door, my colleagues doing AI education so many years ago, all they had was the typed interaction. They couldn't see all that richness. So yeah, I really resonate with that. Janice, you'd like to go. Oh, you have to unmute though, Janice.
Sorry. Thanks, James, for your comments. I think that was really great. And I'd like to layer on to that or drill a little deeper on a different thing that I think is important. So we talked in the panel about multimodal data. And why I think that's important is, we often assess what people are saying and we assess what people are doing, but thinking about multimodal data gives us a metric on the whole sort of perceptual, cognitive, and affective processes of learning. And I think this is really rich and very deep, right? So you sort of talked about breadth in terms of communities and people collaborating. And I wanted to just drill down on this idea of, if you're using eye tracking, you're measuring mind wandering, you're measuring facial recognition or face gesture, galvanic skin response, etc., a whole host of things, you can really get at this full range of, as I said, perceptual, cognitive, and affective. And I think, as a psychologist, those things are incredibly important to an individual learner. And then you could also layer that in with multiple users. So I know Marcelo's done a lot of work on multimodal learning, so perhaps he would like to elaborate. But and then I guess the second point that I want to make is that with the cost of technology going down, these kinds of resources and tools for technology in schools are becoming much more, available to students and teachers and scalable. And when you combine the AI with the availability of the technology, it's really, really the potential for realizing this really deep learning and scaffolding deep learning is really there. So I think it's a really exciting time. We're just working at such an exciting time with respect to our theorizing, the price of technology, the AI and computational techniques for bringing all these things together.
I think that was an opening for you, Marcelo.
Yeah, I was going to say, I can add to that some. I think one of the things I'm really excited about is the sort of introduction of multimodal data and multimodal data to get a better understanding of the user and sort of their behaviors, what they're thinking, how they're feeling, but also of the context. I think James mentioned, doing this work in informal and formal contexts. And I think one of the real challenges in the sort of learning sciences research is to be able to get a good sense of the context, because the context plays such a huge part into the student's learning experience. And so I think that's one of the things I'm really excited about in thinking about the future of AI, is really helping us get a better sense of that context in many of the ways that I think we previously did, largely by the kind of work you were doing, Jeremy, where you're actually in the room watching what's going on, so you really have this good sense of the context. I also think I agree a lot with what James said, in that we're in the future, I think we're really getting closer to being able to do a better job of assessing, evaluating, and supporting learners across the formal and the informal. And even more importantly is bridging between those. Being able to identify the connections that are happening across those different contexts. That too, though, adds one barrier or one challenge, and that's thinking about, at what point do we stop evaluating, assessing students, right? When are students able to turn off? And really, along with that is to what extent they'll be able to have control over their data, and really determining when that data is being used as part of the learning related models that are being developed about them, and sort of when they're just free to be them. And so I think there's important elements about context that we can actually gather and we can incorporate, such that we can start to make some inferences about, okay, this is a moment where a student is trying to demonstrate mastery of something, or students is trying to practice something. And this is, some other context where the student they're just being sarcastic. They're not intending to really say or really mean what they said, sort of thing. So I think that, though, brings into some of these challenges around, as we start to blur the lines between formal and informal, these additional questions around data privacy, and making sure that the ways that students' data is being used is transparent to them, and it's also something that they have a very clear window into.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Marcelo, because it was very present during the panel discussions. And so I want our audience to know this wasn't just looking at the bright, happy side, but also the risks we have to put more attention into addressing. Go ahead, Sidney.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for this great discussion. I would just add, I actually started out working with one-on-one tutoring in physics, so quite the opposite of you, Jeremy. And it was great fun. And then we started working with game-based learning physics through games and the collaboration. And through this entire period, it's just been amazing to just rethink about what is an AI and what is its role. And circling back to what James had mentioned, you know, when kids are talking, they just come alive. And when kids are doing things with the world, with an environment, you know, sparks fly. And being able to have AI support that interaction is really where we think a lot of the opportunities lie. So one of the key recommendations of the report is talking about classroom orchestration. And I just wanted to kind of unpack what that means. It's really this dance, a choreographed dance between the learner, the small teams of learners, the teacher, the materials, and the AI across time and space. And how do we unpack and unfold that is like a super exciting thing. One other thing to just bounce back on, so we're not looking at this through entirely rose-colored glasses, to Marcelo's point on context. Actually, that's one of the things our AI is really bad at, generalizing across contexts at this point, right? So that's like a core challenge for us to be able to solve. And this also gets back into the role of AI, and I want to talk about how AI can interact with the teacher. Because if you look at the report, they characterize, I think, very nicely what are the different capabilities of AI. And we're really not at the point yet or where we will have what's called generalized intelligence. We're at a point where we have some sophistication. And so really understanding like what are the affordances of AI as it is right now when its behaviors really directly impact children's lives. So really thinking about how do we work around the limitations of AI as we understand it clearly, while also trying to improve capabilities. And I think having the teacher as part of that very intricate collaboration is one way forward.
I'm wondering, Janice, if you've seen some of that with the company part of when you have your company hat on, of how to take these science assessment technologies that you work with and really make them in the service of teachers and learners. Oh, again, you have to unmute.
I think I would know this by now. Yeah, thanks for that. So yes, I mean, the teacher technology, I think, as Sidney points out, is fantastic because it just gives teachers this real-time data with which they can orchestrate, it's such a great word, orchestrate what's going on between students, etc. So with our dashboard, which is called Ink Blotter, that's funded by the US Department of Ed and also funded by the NSF Eager program and Cyber Learning program, what we do is we have real-time algorithms that are scoring the students' competencies in science, and they are alerting the teacher in real time. And so the teacher has these various, and our report pointed out, what kinds of data the teachers need, in what format, et cetera. So what we did was we've interviewed about 600 teachers at this point. And so we have a couple of different representational formats that the teacher gets the data in. So the teacher can get the data, kind of the alerts as they're happening. So she can decide, oh, I'm going to go over and see Johnny, I'm going to go over and see Susie, etc. If she sees that there's a number of students that are having problems with the exact same science practice, she can switch to the class view and say how many, and get a sense of how many of my kids are struggling with this exact problem. Because of course, the kids otherwise would have to wait for one-on-one attention. So she can then, 70% of my kids are struggling with this same problem. I'm going to stop the class, so that she can stop the class, do whole class instruction. And of course, this is the beauty of alerting dashboards that have this fine-grained data associated with them. The teacher can also do differentiated instruction. So say if there's 3 kids who are having the exact same problem, she doesn't have to stop the class. She can just pull those kids together. Hey, come on over here by this person's computer screen and help students. So this has been really, really useful for teachers. And during COVID, many teachers used Zoom and Google Hangouts and Google Classroom, and put kids in breakout rooms and use the technology in really creative ways and kept kids on track. In fact, we just put in a paper where we showed several cohorts of students did as well or better than they did in the regular classroom. And perhaps, there's less distraction at home. I don't know. We're starting to unpack that a little bit with the teachers in interviewing them. How did you handle this synchronously or asynchronously or whatever? And we want to understand the extra affordances of this technology. In fact, I had a meeting with Google last week about this with respect to how Inkets and Ink Blotter were used with Google Hangouts during COVID. So these technologies really married very well together. And, we're flexible to adapt to the kinds of things that teachers are telling us with respect to the features they use and how they use the technology. And I think that's what's really cool. You can roll these things out, scale them, use agile programming to make changes on the fly in quotes, right? And it really can support teachers' practices and then in turn students' learning.
Yeah. I really like where you're going with that, Janice, because throughout your remarks, you're really conveying a teacher who's more, it helps with being more aware, with making choices, but you're giving the teacher those opportunities. I think some of our early technologies we saw, I certainly observed classrooms where it was really hard for teachers to know what was going on between the kid and the computer. And that was very unsettling to teachers, that something else was making decisions, instructional decisions, and they didn't know how to coordinate, how to be part of that. And so I think that's a big transition that we have the opportunity to work on and see is how do we augment teaching and help teachers do better.
I don't know if you saw below, there's a message from one of the participants, or not participants, but attendees, who said the chat functionality is not working or is off, so they can't submit questions.
We are getting some questions in the Q&A button. So the chat button is a back channel among panelists. So submit it, even if it's just something you want to make a statement about, just put it in the question and answer, and we'll take those shortly. Before we do, let's see if there's anyone's that are in here we want to take just now. Does anyone have feelings about the Internet of Things and how that's also changing our image here? So it's not just laptops, but there's new devices that are becoming part of the classroom community or the informal learning, kids in a museum or kids at a club. How are new devices becoming? How are we getting beyond that metaphor of a laptop?
Well, one transformative and one of the reasons why I think we had a lot of discussions about kind of going into looking at collaborations and students working together is that there has been enabling technologies, right? And one is the ability to do high quality audio recordings relatively cost effectively. This is what I think Janice was mentioning, the cost of technology going down within reason in classrooms. And so I think microphones and speech are two of the, and speech processing, there have been tremendous advances due to AI there, have really unlocked some of the potential of what we can do in the wild that we had to really do in soundproof rooms and things like that back in the day. And with that, they come in, now these microphones are smart and they can actually look at a table of 6 kids and figure out who's talking to whom and so on and so forth. So from my perspective, I do think when you're having rich learning conversations and you're interacting with a rich environment, like an inquiry learning environment, being able to know what's being said and triangulate that with activities is really a game changer.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I can build on that. I've had the great fun and privilege the past several years of getting to collaborate with Sidney D'Mello Silver, who's a specialist, if you don't know her, in computer-supported collaborative learning. And one of the really fun, I would say, repeated awakenings that I have in working with Cindy is developing this really deep appreciation for what facilitation is. So there is this sort of category of skills that teachers bring to bear onto collaborative learning kinds of situations. And a good facilitator has this kind of like really remarkable ability to look at a group of like 3 or 4 kids as they're solving some, say, science problem, and know when they should intervene. And intervene doesn't mean just like give a hint. It means really like assess the situation, understand if there is discord in the group. Some discord is often like great. It's a productive thing. Or should in fact the facilitator help out a couple of kids working together, while someone else is working on kind of a separate subtask. These new technologies are really making it possible to do that. So we used to just have what I call game trace data coming from game-based learning technologies, but that's beginning to be augmented by gesture, facial expression, location, as Sidney was kind of alluding to. It's just hard to imagine a future like maybe 5 years out where we're not able to like richly instrument very, very inexpensively these kinds of learning interactions. I'll just mention something funny. I recently heard an interview with Yuval Harari, which many of you may know his work, the Sapiens guy. And he made this remark that really made me think. So his remark was, it's not going to be terribly long from now when your refrigerator will understand you better than your partner does. This made me smile and think about the student modeling implications of that, right? So what does it mean when you have a system that can really understand your plans, your goals, your problem solving strategies, and sort of layer over that affect? How can that help not just the students, but of course the teachers? It's an exciting thing to think about.
Yeah, it really reminds me, James, one of the scenarios that's in the report and expressed at some length, but some of our experts had a long discussion about what if we took learning to write as a very broad competency that develops across many different settings and many different classes. You have many different mentors, but often how a student writes in one context is completely invisible to a mentor or a parent or a coach who's trying to support that student in a different context. So what if we could have more knowledge of, hey, this student writes really well when they do this first. Maybe they discuss what their plan for writing with someone. And maybe we've seen that the student can really open up in terms of their writing ability, or maybe it has something to do with the choice of topic. And rather than just like, I'm the science teacher and you're going to write this lab report and that's all I'm about, really, what do we care about long term? We care about students who become great communicators, great collaborators, great writers, great leaders. Can we see those abilities and nurture them more effectively if we can cut across contexts?
If I can, I want to build on this some and really build on some what Sidney said and thinking about really what I see Sidney, part of what you're saying is about context, right? We've now gone from having, these huge mainframe computers to actually having these tiny devices that you can situate, out in a park, in a zoo, on a basketball court, in a museum. And so we've really brought more and more of the computing power more directly to the learners and more directly to the places where learning is taking place, instead of trying to bring learners to places where we want the learning to take place. So I think that's one of the really, really important ideas. But for me, the other thought has to do with providing more tools for learners to learn with. You think about what happens when we put these IoT devices into the hands of learners and let them use those as part of collecting data in the real world and better understanding their own behaviors, better understanding their own learning practices. I think that is one of the other really, really powerful parts about IoT and about thinking about AI more broadly, is what happens when these tools get put into the hands of learners. What are the new ideas, innovations, just the types of inspiration that end up coming out because we now have these much smaller, much cheaper devices, and devices that can do a lot and can do a lot more than even the types of computers that many of us had access to just like 5 years ago.
All right, thanks everyone for that first round. That was a great conversation. I want to turn our attention now, and I'm going to share them on the screen in a second, to the recommendations. And I'll flash those up there. What I'd really love for you to tell us, like, what are you going to do with these recommendations? Is there something in your lab or your next stream of work that you're really going to build off of? And that will help us bring them to life, I believe. So here's our recommendations. First one's about learning, about teaching, about assessment, human-centered, ethics and equity. How are we going to reach out and inform and involve more stakeholders around these issues? So I'd love to turn to you, Sidney, first, because you have the opportunity of this wonderful new institute that's just launching. And I just wonder if some of these recommendations are resonating and you could help people understand a little bit about what your new institute's going to do.
Sure. Thanks, Jeremy. So just a little background. Our institute is centered on student AI, what we call them AI partners. This is when the AI takes on multiple forms and interacts with students, small groups of students, and the teacher. And actually, in looking through these recommendations, we are in many ways kind of addressing all 7, but I want to just talk about one that we've given a lot of thought with, and this came up in some of the Q&A today. We know with great technology comes great responsibility, and so we have an opportunity here to get the ethics and the ethical design and an equity lens correct from the ground up as we're reimagining, and I say we as the community here, AI in education. So we've seen a lot of examples where people have attended to this, down the road, and it has really negative consequences, like with social media. So our approach at our institute is to make ethics and equity like a centerpiece and inform our thinking in every way. So to give you a couple of examples, we are structuring our entire research from a framework called a Framework of Responsible Innovation, where you deeply consider the implications of your technologies, the implications of your data, and you use those to make decisions. So things like, I can just get as much data as possible, have to be questioned. Similarly, we're also thinking of, we just had our first institute-wide retreat last Friday, and we have one on Wednesday and one on this Friday, and we focused on, the first theme was building equitable futures. And the question is, how do we innovate with an equity-focused lens in mind? Because this is the time, and I feel pretty strongly about this, that there are legitimate concerns about data, about AI, about ceding control, about surveillance that have to be addressed. And one of the things we're hoping to do in our institute is use co-design with students, parents, teachers, community leaders, as a mechanism to really understand people's concerns and use that as central features in design, and hopefully come up with a set of guidelines that others might find useful. So while we're covering all of these, I would just say that's kind of our approach to number 5, because we think it's really significant.
Terrific. Does anyone else want to join in the conversation and help us bring one of these to life, or multiple of these to life?
I can chime in and briefly describe some interesting emerging work that we're doing on new learning scenarios. This is recommendation number 1. So much of learning is, of course, as we've all said, happens outside of the classroom. And one of the really interesting places that it happens in non-COVID times is in the museum. So it turns out that there's this whole community of learning researchers who have focused for decades on what it means to learn in informal learning contexts like museums. But curiously, it happens that there are many unanswered questions that we AI Ed kinds of interested people can help out with. And I'll give the example of engagement. We're working on a project to use multimodal learning analytics to model engagement in informal learning contexts centered on museums. So a great open unanswered question is, and this is from the perspective of exhibit designers, how does an exhibit designer know when a learner is engaged? It may, to some people, it may seem obvious, and to other people, it may seem impossibly difficult. We're working the middle of that. But you can actually bring to bear multiple modalities to begin to answer this question of what engagement is. And we're currently focused on a particular exhibit. It's an interactive tabletop exhibit for sustainability. But our expectation, our hope and expectation is that these same kinds of technologies can begin to understand engagement across the whole museum. So sort of the ebb and flow of a visitor experience across the museum. And I think these are the kinds of questions and the kinds of sort of breadth of learning scenarios we're going to be able to begin to support.
One thing I just love about what you brought up, James, and it was in Sidney's answer to it, is the respect for the other stakeholders in the situation, and the feeling that we have to think these things through together. That not just like the computer scientist or the AI expert's going to swoop in, scoop up all the data, and solve the problem, but that there are these really hard questions that we got to get multiple perspectives around, and that's where we're going to make progress. And I love that emphasis, because that's what we saw really come together in the cyber learning program, and what we hope to see people write proposals for the REDL program that really bring those teams together to work on hard problems together. Anyway, anyone else want to chime in on another one of these, or take it from here?
I'll just say a few words, Jeremy. So my comments relate to numbers 5 and 6, develop stronger policies for ethics and equity, and also inform and involve educational policymakers and practitioners. And I think, you know, from my point of view, someone, you know, like everyone on the call, you know, I'm very pro data mining, and I'm very pro computational techniques to analyze data. And I believe that there's kind of a zeitgeist out there where people think that, you know, these algorithms are dangerous and biased. And although there is the potential for that, of course, I do believe that having this work done by universities that have very strict IRB policies and privacy policies, I do believe that we have in our intentions and in our hands the tools to make sure that these algorithms aren't biased. And because we are all working on scalable platforms, we're collecting data from very diverse demographics. So it's not the case that we are building algorithms exclusively in boutique schools and then going into the inner city and going, wow, you know, you guys just can't seem to do this at all, right? And the notion of, you know, all of you know this well, but a held out test set and revalidating your algorithms repeatedly and being mindful about what typical performance is like, and then having a human in the loop, a researcher in the loop going, wow, what's different about this? Wow, oh, there's something different. Let's take a look. Maybe this set of learners has different issues, right? And I think there's a sense in which, and I'm not sure exactly how this came about, maybe it's just kind of paranoia about our Alexas listening to us, but you know, in the zeitgeist in the public is that, you know, AI is super biased. But I want to point out that knowledge engineering is in fact quite biased itself, and perhaps I claim more biased, because more biased in a different way, and perhaps a less dangerous way, dangerous in quotes, because you have an expert blind spot when you're developing knowledge engineered algorithms, and you're constantly comparing the student to an expert, and the expert can't think about all the ways in which a student is going to go about something, and they might be doing something in what we think is very unproductive, but to them they're starting to understand, they're wanting to learn the system, they're wanting to kind of explore, take a simulation based environment. And Marcelo made a point earlier about this as well. The student wants to be free to maybe explore, right? And in knowledge engineering, you're just jumping on the kid right away. In data mining, you know, we use these long trajectories to say, well, what is the likelihood the kid's going to get to the place I want him to get to or her to get to from where they are? So I guess I just want to say that I think there's a big concern about the bias in algorithms, but I think we've always had those issues. It's come more to the fore because it's part of the public's kind of understanding of what's going on with our various devices at home, listening to us, etc. But I think this is where we really need to articulate to the communities and the stakeholders, and Sidney mentioned this as well, that are interested, and lead them to understand the ways in which we're developing these, validating these, testing these with diverse demographics.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's really, really quite important right now.
It really speaks to number 6. That it's one thing for us to say we think we're making progress, but you know, it's in the eyes of the beholders as well. Right. They have to feel they have a good reason for some confidence. It's going to be challenging. It's going to take a while. Do others want to talk about a recommendation, or should we open it up to questions and answers?
I can chime in real quick on a couple of ideas that really try to bridge across some of these different recommendations. One of them really has to do with, and I've got a current project that's around really trying to support teachers and doing work to collect audio data, collect some video data from small groups. And I think it bridges with some of the ideas of being human-centered in that we're trying to really take into consideration what are students comfortable with, what are students willing to share in terms of their data, and then subsequently, how do we make sure that the data that we're collecting can actually be used in an actionable fashion by the students and the teachers. So in some sense, trying to move away from a model where we are just mining data to also be able to provide some sort of tangible benefit to users. And in some sense, I think that also goes to this idea of trying to support a broader range of learning scenarios by providing teachers with additional support in a space that might otherwise seem cumbersome, or might seem complex, or really you've got a bunch of small groups working together, and that can be somewhat intimidating. And say, well, let's bring in these tools, let's bring in AI as a way to support you in doing this. The other work that I'll briefly mention is a cyber learning grant that has really been about introducing new modalities for people to engage with different learning environments. And part of this is brought into play as a perspective of accessibility and saying, look, let's make sure that we have ways for people who may have visual impairments, might have hearing impairments, who may have fine motor impairments, to be able to interact with the given learning environments that we've developed in ways that are natural to them. Mm-hmm. And I think that for me is one of the really exciting things about AI, and just more broadly to say that instead of trying to set up these systems, and I think Janice, you talked about the sum of where students are having to have to very sort of explicitly craft their knowledge in a way that fits the system. It is instead the job of the system to make sense of the knowledge that students are sharing in the ways that feel natural to them. And so I think that's, for me, one of the super exciting things that my lab is currently working on.
This sounds really exciting. Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to turn off the share in a second. And I think we should go and try to take some of the questions and answers that are coming up from people and respond to some of those. I do want to let people know that our website is circles.org. And if you go there, there's a banner that takes you right to this report. And so that's how you can get the report. It should be posted now. We also really invite you to, in general, join our newsletter to get much more information of this kind. Not too frequently, probably about once a month we'll post a newsletter. Let me just stop sharing, and let's see what we've got in questions and answers. Has anyone had a chance to peruse that and pick one that they wanted to answer? And we have a team at Digital Promise. If you want to nominate one for us that we should take up now, that would be just fine.
There was from Jody Asbell Clark asking about how the panel deals with school IRB in research, especially with younger children, and how are their research instruments able to deal with the motion in realistic classrooms when measuring things such as affect or attention with technology? Are there any promising advances?
That seems like a great one for you to start, Sidney.
Yeah. With respect to small children, our policies are to always get full IRB, get parental permissions, and the one thing we found to be really helpful is really working within what is the tolerance of each school and each parent. So giving a palette of options. So specifically to your question on video data, what we do is many times we don't actually record the video. We will grab the video, get the information we want out of it, and then discard the video. We actually show parents in the consent form what information we're getting out and how it could be used. So specifically, for example, sometimes we're just interested in looking at certain facial expressions, and we will go to considerable lengths to not include data that could subsequently be used for identification, even if it could be, even if just an IRB would allow you to do that. So the IRB is like a starting place for the conversation, but that just satisfies the university. And then really, from my experience, it's really been just basically coming up with a palette of options, let people opt in and opt out of different data streams. And it's a responsibility of a researcher to figure out how to put it together and have robust algorithms that can be missing certain channels from some people and others.
I love the idea in what you're saying there, that the IRB is only going to take us so far. And then it's the responsibility of this community. I think there are precedents where research communities have come together to really vet a data set, figure out what should be in, what should be out, and also vet who should have rights to use it and what training and agreements have to be in place before they can use it. And so I think there are some models beyond, let's collect everything and we're not going to tell you who's going to use it. And there's models beyond asking your IRB. And so I hope more of those will come to the fore as this community goes forward. Some more. There's some questions in here. Simon Buckingham Showman asks one, that some of this is going to happen out in the industry. How do panelists imagine we're going to be able to work with, engage, support, inform industry to help make this better, not just in our research projects, but to set a precedent that goes into maybe applications beyond those that we're designing?
I can take that one, and I'll take a slightly different perspective on it. I would say my biggest concern here, and this has been a concern for a couple of decades, I spent some time in industry, is that they will ignore us. So the big concern is that there is a very significant opportunity out there. It's not just learning, which is kind of what we're focused on here, but it's really learning and training. And if you think about what is sort of the business case for these technologies, it's very strong. And so there is a very significant, sizable capitalist motivation for moving forward and moving forward very quickly. So my main concern is that they do that. And that the kinds of things that we've learned, and I really mean we more broadly. So I'm thinking about all of the learning scientists, the educational psychologists, for the last 20 or 30 years, we've learned a lot that can deeply inform how to design technologies to support learning experiences. But unless one of two things happen, either the market forces it, or there's some kind of regulatory force in place, it's just going to be chaos. Mm-hmm. So it's a very, very important question.
You hear a talk in AI about fairness, accountability, and transparency, FAT, as one set of values that we have to be careful that players in the space honor. But again, I think there's things we can do that doesn't really get you all the way to equity. So a lot to do here. Marcelo, I think it seems like you had a thought.
Yeah, I was going to add in that I think at times these opportunities can kind of be mediated through the sort of nonprofits and schools that I think that we work with. So, right, schools and school districts are oftentimes interacting with these different companies. And so I think when you start to bring together the various stakeholders, is I think where you can start to make a little bit more traction. I will say I absolutely agree with James too, though, is that I've had a number of instances companies come and say, hey, we see the stuff you're doing in multimodal learning analytics. We want to use this to be able to predict which of these 6th grade kids is going to be most likely to go to college. And it's that sort of perspective that ends up being a little bit concerning. And I think from sort of like a learning sciences education research perspective, you end up having these concerns about what are the intentions, and have the companies, have these sort of external entities also taken up the concerns around ethics, the concerns around equity, the concerns around data privacy. And so I think in some respect, I think part of, and this is why I think this is one of the recommendations in this report, is that alongside all of the analytics that is being done, we really have to think about how are we going to be responsible about the kinds of AI that we're developing, and making sure that that conversation is happening in parallel. Because if not, I think there definitely is a huge concern about some of these approaches being misused and being used in ways that don't demonstrate, one, a fundamental understanding of the education research that sort of undergirds those strategies and those approaches, but also some concern about the ways the companies are going to end up trying to actually use the different AI that's being developed.
Terrific. Let's just take one more question, just maybe about 2 minutes. I'm drawn to one that Phil Wynn asks about AI in terms of assessing for learning, not necessarily just summative research, but how might AI information suggest to students and their peers what resources to use, how to interact with someone. And I really sense in our expert panel, it was all formative assessment, assessing for learning, where people saw the future and very little summative. But I'm wondering, for example, Janice, yeah, you might see that in your work. And unmute.
Yeah. So thanks for the question, Phil. So what we've been doing is we have developed algorithms for real-time performance assessment of students' competencies for science. And Val Shute, of course, refers to this as stealth assessment. So the student, although I'm very sensitive to Marcelo's point, is the student thinking, oh my God, am I constantly being assessed? And when can I just explore, right? So the teacher can use this as benchmark assessments. But the thing that I sort of think is important along these lines, and it relates to, you know, I think this formative, summative kind of issue is important, but we have the technology to take benchmark assessments. And I do believe that I think what is important about the kinds of work that we're all doing is we can look at a certain student, and if we're going to make a high stakes decision about that student, whether they're going to get into Stanford or et cetera, versus another institution, we have to be able to look at that student's data and say, how representative is this performance of what this young woman usually does? And I really see an opportunity for us to kind of look across students' trajectories and say, you know, this is kind of the way they actually perform. Or, you know what, looks like they had a really bad day. Well, you shouldn't be making high stakes decisions that are really going to affect an individual's life in the long run based on one data point, right?
Yeah.
So what I really think is,
or maybe it diffuses high stakes tests and
exactly, right. You know, I was on the AI panel for the UK, as was Simon, a couple of weeks ago, and there was sort of a similar issue. I mean, it wasn't exactly, it had to do with data aggregation and et cetera, to come up with predictive scores about students who hadn't taken, you know, the A-level exams. But I mean, it's sort of a similar argument. You really want the students' data to have face validity with respect to the kinds of skills and competencies they have, and not just with respect to on this day and they had a good day, or damn it, they had a really bad day. And now, you know, because it's so stressful for them. And it's really, frankly, you know, it would be much, much better to have these benchmark assessments or a nice trajectory of assessment for students across years and years.
Thank you, Janice. And I want to take a moment now to wrap up and thank all our panelists. This has been a wonderful conversation. Of course, there's much more to talk about, and we imagine this just as a start. But thanks, James Lester. Thank you, Sidney D'Mello. Thank you, Marcelo Worsley. And thank you, Janice, for joining us today. Thank you to your 18 other colleagues who are part of the original meeting as well. And I'll just close by showing you, this is our website, circles.org. And you can find the report, and here's where you can download and the executive summary. is here. We also invite you to follow us at Circles.org on Twitter, sign up for our newsletter, be part of the conversation going forward. This is going to be at least a 3-year conversation, but this is just the beginning of. And finally, in closing, thanks again to the National Science Foundation and to the U.S. Department of Education, both which participated in helping shape and make this opportunity to have this expert panel possible. So thank you all, and we look forward to being in touch with all of you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye now.